speaking if there is any question, but he said that this is a story. It is maybe not. I think maybe the point of the questions that we discussed already covered in Peter's presentation, and so the possible I myself thinking that the possible questions would be, interactive discussion will be with you. Is that okay?
With me? Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
Look, you do have there. Natalie did prepare a few questions for you to prompt at different stages, but most of the battle, there's no questions, etc. But if you don't ask any questions, I'll just keep going. If there's, you can jump in and ask questions if you need to.
Okay.
And is there a question and answer session at the end?
Yes, it is. It is. We will have 10 to 15 minutes allowing participants to ask or to discuss things with you both.
Okay. All right.
And the last one, we will have quizzes to students, and 5 questions to students, to participant. Quiz
to make sure that they've been paying attention. So I think Pete and I should participate in that as well, because we might not get all the answers right.
Yeah, I don't know about that.
But we ensure you that it will be fun.
Okay.
Why are the two of us really big now? Is that on purpose?
Yeah, the host has spotlighted us.
All right, great.
Okay. I think I need my glasses. It's better to open.
You can pop yourself on mute, Pete, bottom left, while Zainab is introducing everyone.
How do I do that bottom left? Oh, yeah, yep, okay. I'll just do that now.
Yeah.
And I thought Peter, I asked Peter, is it possible to, it will be the language will be, some parts will be delivered in Bahasa Indonesia. Okay. Mbak Tenti, Mas Ibeng, apakah sudah join?
Belum, on the way, Pak.
Okay, we will wait minutes for Pak Bambang to join us. He will deliver the welcome speech. And now join us around 50, is it? Around 50 students and participants from schools. I think they're also teachers. We will start our learning session. Kita akan mulai. Pak Bambang sudah bergabung. Kami pikir seluruh komponen untuk mendukung acara learning session sudah hadir di screen. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Shalom. Om Swastiastu, Namo Buddhaya, salam kebajikan, Rahayu. Selamat datang, selamat bergabung untuk adik-adik semua di dalam acara learning session ini. Dan selain adik-adik, ada juga Bapak Ibu guru dan dari adik-adik dari universitas dan dari lembaga lainnya. Perkenalkan, semoga semua sehat, salam sehat, dan tetap semangat. Dua hal ini penting untuk kita saat ini dalam kondisi pandemi. Perkenalkan, saya Zainab Tahir dari Marine Heritage Gallery. Bersama rekan-rekan saya juga bergabung di sini, dan ada Pak Bambang Aditya Nugraha. He is the future director of Marine Services, and allow me to say hi to our two respected speakers. Chief Petty Officer Peter Cannon from Royal Australian Navy, and Dr. Natalie Pearson from the University of Sydney. Thank you for saying yes, joining us in this learning session. And this is quite an epic moment. At the same time, 8 years ago, I think 8 years ago, HMS Perth and USS Houston lie in her final rest on the bottom of Banten Bay. And as we are speaking or talking today in learning session, at the same time on board the Indonesian naval ship, together with some fellows from Australian Embassy and US Embassy, commemorating the 80 years of the Battle of Sunda Strait. And to begin with, we will invite Pak Bambang Aditya Nugraha, Deputy Director of Marine Services, to deliver his welcome speech. Mas Ibeng, silahkan.
Baik, terima kasih Mbak Zainab. Suara saya sudah jelas ya Mbak Zainab ya? Baik, terima kasih. Pertama-tama, I would like to say hello to my colleague here from Australia, of course. Good afternoon, Chief Petty Officer, Mr. Peter Cannon, and Dr. Natalie Pearson from the University of Sydney. I think it's a pleasure to have both of you in this learning session. Thank you very much. Really appreciate for your time. And I have the honor to deliver this remark on behalf of my director, who is currently have a parallel meeting that he couldn't leave. So like Mbak Zainab said that my name is Bambang. I'm one of the deputy director in Marine Services, especially handling for the marine tourism and underwater maritime heritage. I think the learning session is, just for your information, learning session is a regular event held every month, and it's intended for the student starting from the elementary level to college student, and also for the general public, in order to get know Indonesian's marine resources and maritime history through our collection in Marine Gallery. So this is even used to, before 2020, is directly held offline, so participant can communicate and can visit directly the gallery. But during the pandemic, the learning session is conducted online. And before we started, I think allow me to greeting our participant from Indonesia and deliver the welcome speech in Bahasa. Baik, selamat siang adik-adik, Bapak Ibu sekalian, salam sehat dan semoga tetap semangat ya. Jadi seperti yang kami tadi sampaikan, learning session merupakan acara yang setiap bulan kita laksanakan untuk teman-teman atau adik-adik kita dari level mungkin SD, SMP, sampai dengan mahasiswa, dan juga dibuka untuk masyarakat umum agar kita semua dapat mengenal sumber daya kelautan dan sejarah maritim Indonesia pada khususnya ya, melalui koleksi-koleksi kita yang ada di Marine Heritage Gallery. Jadi sebagai gambaran buat adik-adik dan Bapak Ibu semuanya, galeri kita ini memajang koleksi tunggal, yaitu artefak-artefak benda muatan kapal tenggelam atau yang kita singkat dengan BMKT, yang diangkat dari perairan Indonesia. Ada beberapa lokasi ya, kalau kita lihat ada di perairan Kepulauan Riau, kemudian Laut Jawa, Selat Malaka, dan lain sebagainya. BMKT yang ditemukan di dasar laut kita umumnya merupakan barang dagangan dan beberapa merupakan barang persembahan atau cindera mata, juga milik perseorangan. asalnya itu banyak yang dari Cina, Timur Tengah, Eropa, dan beberapa negara di Asia Tenggara seperti Thailand dan Vietnam. Usianya bisa dikategorikan ratusan tahun berdasarkan hasil penelitian dari para ahli, bahkan mungkin ribuan tahun. Jadi peninggalan-peninggalan tersebut merupakan legacy dan bukti bahwa perairan kita merupakan jalur pelayaran global yang strategis. Kalau kita di SD atau SMP atau SMA ya sering mendengar jalur sutra, itu Indonesia sebagai bagian dari jalur sutra, inilah bukti bahwa kita memang memiliki lokasi yang strategis. Adik-adik, Bapak Ibu semua yang saya hormati, jadi setiap learning session, setiap bulannya kami menghadirkan tema yang baru berkaitan dengan laut. Kalau bulan lalu kita mengajak adik-adik mengenal hiu paus, hewan raksasa penghuni laut kita, maka pada learning session kali ini, pada hari ini, kita mengajak untuk mendengarkan cerita peristiwa bersejarah yang terjadi 80 tahun yang lalu di tengah Selat Sunda, tepatnya di Teluk Banten, yang dikenal dengan pertempuran Selat Sunda atau the Battle of Sunda Strait. Jadi bagaimana pertempuran itu terjadi, siapa saja yang terlibat, dan bagaimana kita memaknai peristiwa tersebut, itu sangat penting bagi teman-teman sebagai generasi muda ya. Agar adik-adik mendapatkan perspektif yang lengkap, kami langsung mengundang dua narasumber dari Australia, yaitu Chief Petty Officer Mr. Cannon dari Royal Australian Navy dan Dr. Natalie Person from the University of Sydney untuk berbagi cerita. Jadi perlu diketahui bahwa Australia salah satu negara yang kapal perangnya itu tenggelam di perairan Teluk Banten kurang lebih pada tahun 1942. Negara lain pun ada ya, seperti Amerika dan Jepang. Nah, bagi Australia dan negara sahabat lainnya, lokasi peristiwa Selat Sunda merupakan war grave dengan banyaknya tentara-tentara yang gugur dalam peristiwa tersebut. Sementara bagi kita, Indonesia, peristiwa ini membawa pengaruh yang cukup kuat dalam konstelasi perjuangan kemerdekaan menuju terbentuknya negara kita saat ini. Adik-adik, Bapak, Ibu, dan saudara yang kami hargai, yang saya hargai, laut menghubungkan kita dengan bangsa lain. Tidak hanya dahulu kala, tapi juga saat ini, keberadaan kerangka kapal Australia, Amerika, Jepang, dan negara lainnya di perairan kita memberikan pelajaran berharga akan pentingnya hubungan baik, kerjasama untuk memelihara peninggalan sejarah yang membawa pesan perdamaian dan kemanusiaan. Dan tentunya saling bahu-membahu untuk menjadikan peninggalan tersebut bermanfaat bagi masyarakat dan generasi muda. Saya ucapkan selamat mengikuti learning session kali ini, dan kami berharap materi kali ini dapat memberikan informasi, menambah wawasan, dan terakhir, I would like to thank to both of you, the speaker, for being here, dan semoga Marine Heritage Gallery dapat segera dibuka kembali, sehingga kita dapat menerima kunjungan teman-teman semuanya secara langsung, dan kita dapat langsung bertatap muka. Demikian mungkin pengantar dari kami atas nama Pak Direktur. Kami ucapkan terima kasih. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Terima kasih, Mbak Jen.
Terima kasih Pak Ibeng. Nah, selanjutnya sebelum kita mempersilahkan dua narasumber untuk bicara, kami ingin mengajak adik-adik untuk melihat Marine Heritage Gallery. Seharusnya sih ini langsung nih, learning session-nya bisa langsung diadakan di Marine Heritage Gallery, di galeri, tapi karena kondisi pandemi seperti yang disampaikan Pak Bambang tadi, jadi kita masih close. Nah, kita mau mengajak adik-adik untuk tur dulu bersama kurator Marine Heritage Gallery, ada Mbak Venta. Nanti akan diputar profil galeri untuk memberikan gambaran tentang galeri itu sendiri, apa koleksinya, dan tentang apa, hal apa saja yang ada di dalam situ, dan fungsinya apa, sekaligus nanti ada virtual tour untuk mengajak mengenal koleksi, salah satu koleksi yang ada di galeri. Nah, saya tahu, sepertinya saya mengenal salah satu partisipan yang pernah berkunjung ke galeri di sini. Nanti, kalau tidak salah ada Aurel ya. I think Aurel can share experience how when she visited gallery, her impression, how what to get there after visiting the gallery. Right, Aurel? Nah,
Yes.
Mbak Venta, silakan turnya, dan adik-adik selamat menikmati turnya. And Natalie and Pete, we will have a virtual tour for the gallery first.
Sebuah tempat yang diresmikan pada 13 Maret 2017 untuk menyambungkan Anda, saya, dan kita semua dengan sejarah maritim Nusantara ratusan tahun yang lalu. Galeri ini memamerkan benda muatan kapal yang tenggelam di perairan kita berabad-abad lampau. Saksi materi bahwa sejak dahulu, laut kita telah menjadi penghubung antar masyarakat dan bangsa lain yang berada di Asia, Timur Tengah, dan Eropa. Galeri ini memamerkan kurang lebih 1.500 koleksi benda muatan kapal tenggelam yang diangkat dari 3 perairan, yaitu Bangka Belitung, Laut Jawa Utara Cirebon, dan Pulau Buaya, Kepulauan Riau. BMKT Belitung. Benda muatan kapal tenggelam yang ditemukan di Belitung berasal dari abad 9 Masehi. Kebanyakan jenisnya keramik yang dibuat di Cina pada era dinasti Tang yang berkuasa pada tahun 618 hingga 907 Masehi. Kapal yang mengangkutnya memiliki ciri konstruksi kapal Timur Tengah yang dikenal dengan nama Arabian Dome, tenggelam di Belitung dalam perjalanannya menuju salah satu kerajaan di Timur Tengah pada abad ke-9 Masehi. BMKT Cirebon. BMKT Cirebon diangkat dari Laut Jawa Utara Cirebon. Muatannya berasal dari abad ke-10 Masehi. BMKT Cirebon merupakan penemuan komoditas perdagangan terbesar di perairan Indonesia hingga saat ini, dengan muatan yang diperkirakan hingga 450.000 keping barang. Sekitar 80% muatannya berasal dari era 5 dinasti di Cina. Sebagian kecilnya berasal dari Timur Tengah dan beberapa komunitas di Asia Tenggara. Dari variasi temuan dan ciri konstruksi kapal, perdagangan jarak jauh antara Cina, kerajaan di Nusantara, Timur Tengah telah terjalin sejak tahun 900-an Masehi. BMKT Pulau Buaya. Dinamakan BMKT Pulau Buaya karena ditemukan di perairan Pulau Buaya, Kepulauan Riau. Dari lokasi tersebut diangkat sekitar 30.000 keping muatan dari abad 12 hingga 13 Masehi. Muatan yang ditemukan antara lain keramik berasal dari dinasti Song, berkuasa pada abad 10 hingga 13 Masehi, botol kaca dari Timur Tengah, dan wadah tanah liat yang bercirikan Asia Selatan. Diperkirakan kapal yang membawa muatan tersebut menuju salah satu kerajaan di Sumatera, tapi tenggelam sebelum mencapai tujuan. Kementerian Kelautan dan Perikanan mengelola 200.000 lebih koleksi dari abad 9 hingga 19 Masehi. Secara berkala akan dipamerkan di Marine Heritage Gallery ini. Kami ingin agar masyarakat mengetahui bahwa Laut Indonesia itu tidak hanya kaya dengan ikan dan ragam terumbu karang, tapi juga ada kapal tenggelam dan muatannya yang menjadi bukti sejarah Indonesia sebagai negara maritim. Kami ingin Marine Heritage Gallery menjadi learning center tentang sejarah maritim dan tentang kekayaan laut Indonesia. Menjadi media membangun kecintaan kita terhadap laut, membangkitkan kebanggaan dan keyakinan bahwa kita adalah poros maritim dari dulu, sekarang, dan yang akan datang. Selamat berkunjung di Marine Heritage Gallery. Mari berbangga sebagai bagian dari Indonesia, negara maritim yang menjadikan laut sebagai masa depan dan pemersatu.
Halo sahabat galeri, selamat datang di Marine Heritage Gallery. Jumpa lagi dengan kami, dan pada sesi kali ini kita akan mengulas lebih jauh lagi mengenai salah satu PMKT yang merupakan koleksi dari Marine Heritage Gallery. Kali ini kita akan mengulas mengenai Arca Dewi Tara. Arca Dewi Tara merupakan salah satu koleksi yang ditemukan pada kapal karam dari perairan Cirebon yang diangkat pada tahun 2005 dari kedalaman 40 meter. Arca ini diangkat bersama dengan PMKT lainnya seperti keramik, kristal kaca, manik-manik, koin, dan benda-benda perunggu lainnya. Arca Dewi Tara merupakan salah satu benda religi.
Suaranya hilang, Mbak Je?
Ada di agama Buddha. Dan adanya barang-barang religi yang ditemukan pada PMKT yang ada di perairan Cirebon ini mengindikasikan bahwa pada zaman itu sudah agama Buddha sudah mulai masuk ke Nusantara. Arca Dewi Tara yang ditemukan ini, dia digambarkan sedang duduk di atas bunga teratai atau yang sering disebut dengan Padmasana. Dan dengan posisi badannya, dia posisi badan menyondong seperti itu dan sedang memegang panah. Tetapi pada saat ditemukan, panahnya ini sudah nggak ada ya. Lalu dia juga punya hiasan di atas kepalanya, itu mahkota. Mahkotanya ini agak silindris dan mengerucut ke atas. Lalu pada bagian puncaknya itu ada seperti bulatan seperti itu. Jenis mahkota yang seperti ini dikenal dengan nama Kirita Mahkota. Dalam salah satu inskripsi yang ditemukan di Gua Kandheri, India, Dewi Tara merupakan salah satu dewi pelindung kapal. Pemujaan Dewi Tara erat kaitannya dengan keselamatan di bidang maritim. Ya, sekian sahabat galeri penjelasan kita mengenai Arca Dewi Tara pada kali ini. Untuk selanjutnya kita akan mengulas lagi PMKT atau koleksi, salah satu koleksi yang ada di Marine Heritage Gallery lainnya, dan tentunya nggak kalah menarik dengan yang kita ulas pada hari ini. Jadi sahabat galeri, ikuti terus learning session Marine Heritage Gallery di bulan mendatang. Sahabat galeri, jangan lupa untuk memfollow Instagram kami di mhg.kkp untuk mengetahui learning session berikutnya dan informasi seputar koleksi-koleksi dan kegiatan lain yang ada di Marine Heritage Gallery. Terima kasih.
Oke, nah terima kasih Mbak Venta, Kak Venta atas turnya. Arca Dewi Tara yang tadi ditampilkan itu dengan usia tenggelam dengan satu konteks temuan yang ada itu diperkirakan dari tahun 900-an sekian. Jadi usia penemuannya itu sudah 1000 tahun lebih. Dan itu ada koleksinya originally ada di Marine Heritage Gallery. Dan itu tidak dari Cina, itu kembali penanda bahwa hubungan antara Nusantara waktu itu terjalin erat dengan yang lainnya, dengan termasuk hubungan keagamaan, bukan hanya perdagangan saja, tapi itu adalah menurut ahli, menurut para pakar, ada beberapa kemungkinan ada pendeta yang on board pada abad ke-10 itu di kapal yang tenggelam di Laut Jawa Utara Cirebon. Oke, kita melanjutkan masuk ke sesi utama kita. Ada pesan sponsor. Semoga setelah pandemi berakhir kami mengundang adik-adik untuk berkunjung ke Marine Heritage Gallery. Itu terbuka selama mulai Senin sampai Jumat, dari jam 8 sampai jam 3 sore. Jadi semoga satu waktu kita akan ketemu di sana. Nah, selanjutnya kita masuk ke sesi utama dan akan mengundang 2 narasumber. I would like to invite our speakers to share the story of the Battle of Sunda Straits and insight on the significance of the HMS Perth. And I will invite first the Chief Petty Officer Peter Cannon. He is Chief Petty Officer. I will read his brief bio. Sorry, he is Chief Petty Officer Electronics Technician in the Royal Australian Navy, joining in 1993. Peter has served in the destroyers Perth, Hobart, and Brisbane, and the amphibious assault ships Manura, Kanimbla, and Canberra. He saw operational service in the Persian Gulf and Solomon Islands, as well as disaster relief in Indonesia, specializing in the late interwar and early Second World War periods. Peter is a naval history researcher and writer, publishing in Australia, the United Kingdom, and United States. A former naval history instructor at the Royal Australian Naval College. Peter is currently serving ashore in the Royal Australian Navy's Technical Training Organization. And our second speaker is Dr. Natalie Pearson. She is Curriculum Coordinator at the Sydney Southeast Asia Centre at the University of Sydney. Her research focuses on the protection, management, and interpretation of underwater cultural heritage in Southeast Asia. And I will invite Peter first to share the story of the battle. You will have 30 minutes to share with us. Thank you. The screen is yours.
Thank you very much for inviting us.
So I'm going to share the screen from my end, and yeah, we can hear you.
Thank you, Natalie.
Okay.
Okay. So Zainab, did you want to ask Pete questions, or should he just speak?
I hope that I thought that several questions for me will be covered in Peter's presentations. It will be like the inside. Can you please give us like describe briefly about what is HMS Perth look like as a ship? What is it built? What was it built, and what is the role of HMS Perth during World War II, and a sister ship of HMS Perth, and also what has happened in 1942.
Okay. Good afternoon, Indonesia. HMAS Perth was a cruiser. Now, in naval history, a cruiser was a medium-sized warship. You had very small warships like destroyers, and then you had very big, heavily armed warships called battleships, and a cruiser sat in the middle. And a cruiser was designed to support battleships and also to support destroyers in different roles. The Australian Navy, at the start of the Second World War, we only had 5 cruisers. They had been bought from the United Kingdom, from Britain, and Perth had only just been bought a few months before the start of the Second World War. We had 2 of her sister ships, Sydney and Hobart, And Perth itself had been built in 1936 in Britain. Now, ships back then, most warships were they were steam driven, so they had boilers and turbines, and that's how they were driven. Now, Perth was a medium-sized cruiser. She wasn't a large one, she wasn't a very small one, but she was quite modern, and she was fitted with 8 6-inch guns in twin turrets, as you can probably see from the painting there, and she was relatively fast at 31 knots. Her commanding officer was the name of Captain Hector Waller, and he was one of the most impressive naval officers that the Australian Navy has ever produced. He was a very, very well-respected combat leader, and he ran a very, very efficient ship with an efficient crew. And Perth herself was carrying 681 sailors when she deployed to Indonesia. But prior to that, she'd served in the Caribbean between 1939 to 1940. She'd served with the British Mediterranean Fleet from December 1940 to July 1941, during which time she participated in the battles of Matapan and the battles of Crete against the Italians and the Germans. So why was she in Indonesia? Well, while she was in Indonesia, the Japanese had come into the war, and the Japanese had already conquered Singapore, British Malaya. They'd mostly taken the Philippines off America, and they'd also taken a lot of Indonesia. And the end game for the Japanese conquest of Southeast Asia was to defeat Java. And the British, Americans, and Australians all had forces in the area to attempt to defend Java. But the Dutch at the time were in control of the naval assets. So the Dutch Admiral Conrad Helfrich, he actually was born in Indonesia and raised in Indonesia, and he was in charge of the naval forces in that area. His seagoing commander went by the name of Rear Admiral Carroll Dorman, and he was in charge of the ships in the area. Now, the ships comprised British Royal Navy ships, US Navy ships, Australian ships, and also Netherlands East Indies ships. And the reason why the Dutch were in charge of this was because the British and Americans were really only fighting the Japanese. They were fighting a delaying action. They knew they couldn't stop the Japanese in Java. They pretty much knew that Java was going to fall, so they were only using their forces that they had in the area, while they concentrated most of their reinforcements in Hawaii with the Americans and in Sri Lanka with the British. So the British and Americans weren't going to put any more forces into the area, and it was politically expedient to leave the Dutch admirals, I suppose, in control, even though the Dutch hadn't fought a war at sea in over 150 years. And the navy that they had in Indonesia was not trained or set up to be able to fight a modern naval battle. So in February 1942, the Australian government was asked to supply another cruiser, and they ended up sending Perth up to Indonesia to aid in the final battle for Java, even though that we didn't have many warships left in Australia at that particular time. But she was still sent up. So at this particular point, I'll get to USS Houston in a sec, but the Japanese were about to invade Asia with 2 very, very large convoys. One in the east, the Eastern Invasion Convoy, was aiming for Kragan. I've probably mispronounced that, in Eastern Java, near about 150 kilometres from Surabaya. And then a big Western attack convoy, which was aiming for Bunton Bay in the west of Java. Now, the other ship we're talking about today is USS Houston. USS Houston came from the US Asiatic Fleet, and that was nominally based in the Philippines, but they had already lost their base in the Philippines, and the US Navy forces in the area had actually fallen back on Surabaya to join the Netherlands East Indies. And Houston was a bit older than Perth. She had been built in 1930, but she was a bit bigger, and she was more powerfully armed. She had 9 8-inch guns, and she had been designed to fight battles at long range. She didn't have any torpedoes, and her gun turrets, they turned relatively slowly to engage targets at long range. They weren't really much good for close-in action, which she was about to encounter in the Sunda Strait. But she was under the command of Captain Albert Rooks. And Rooks would go on to be awarded the US military's highest award for bravery, the Congressional Medal of Honor, for his actions in Indonesia in February 1942. And Houston was carrying 1,061 officers and men at the time. So the first action that was fought was the Battle of the Java Sea. Kirill Dorman had split his forces into two, but knowing the Japanese were approaching, he combined his forces into what was called the Combined Striking Force. And there were 5 Allied cruisers and 9 destroyers. And he went out to do battle with the Japanese, but unfortunately, there were a range of problems with the Allied integration. They'd never worked together before. And Dorman's tactics were poor. They were not good tactics, and they were not suited to the way the Japanese fought. And unfortunately, the battle was a disaster for the Allies. It lasted for 8 hours. During the day and well into the night. And they suffered casualties. HMS Exeter was a big British cruiser, and she was knocked out and had to retire to Surabaya. And in the night, Kirill Dorman led a final charge at the enemy, essentially, with the Dutch cruisers De Ruyter, Java, USS Houston, and HMAS Perth. But unfortunately, 2 big Japanese cruisers, the Harugo and the Nachi, they intercepted this thrust, and with torpedoes, they destroyed both of the Dutch cruisers in one very big torpedo salvo. And unfortunately, Kirill Dorman was lost in De Ruyter along with 367 other men, and Java suffered 512 men killed. And that left Perth as the only undamaged cruiser in the force. And with Captain Waller being senior to Captain Rooks, he took charge of the 2 ships and he retreated to Tanjung Priok, the port of Batavia. There was nothing more to gain.
Can I just ask you one question before you go on to Tanjung Priok? Were the Europeans the only ones involved in that battle? The Allies?
No, they weren't. Well, they weren't, because the Netherlands East Indies, especially the colonial navy, their cruisers like De Ruyter and Java, and another cruiser, another destroyer, the Kortener, which was lost during this battle, they were mainly crewed by Indonesians. I believe almost exclusively Dutch officered, and many of these Dutch officers had been trained in Europe. But the majority of the crew, they were all locals. So the majority of the casualties suffered in De Ruyter, Java, and Kortener were all local Indonesians. So after the Battle of the Java Sea, the Perth and Houston retired to Tanjung Priok, and they were ordered by Admiral Helfrich to transit through the Sunda Strait to go to the south of Java and to try and continue the fight. Exeter, USS Pope, a destroyer, and HMS Electra, another destroyer, they retired to Surabaya, and they tried to make their escape separately. But they were caught on the 1st of March, actually, in the second Battle of the Java Sea, and they were all destroyed by an overwhelming Japanese task force. But after trying to get fuel and ammunition in Tanjung Priok, the Perth and the Houston, they were ordered to head south. There wasn't any ammunition to be had. Perth was down to nearly half of her ammunition. She was nominally fitted with 250 rounds per main gun. She was down to 160 rounds per main gun. USS Houston was only down to 50 rounds per gun for her larger 8-inch guns, and they didn't have a lot of fuel. So there was one other ship that was supposed to attend with them, and that was the Dutch destroyer Evertsen. But because of a miscommunication, Evertsen wasn't ready to sail when Perth and Houston sailed at about 7 o'clock that night, just as night was falling. So on to the actual Battle of Sunda Strait itself. Incidentally, the Japanese named this the Sea Engagement off Batavia, is the Japanese name for the battle. And Perth and Houston, as mentioned, were designated to sail through the very confined waters of Sunda Strait to reach the Indian Ocean. And after they'd sailed after dark, Captain Waller wasn't expecting the enemy. Allied intelligence had said that the Sunda Strait was clear. And as I've mentioned, the ships were not in a good state. Their crews were exhausted. They just fought an 8-hour battle. They had to resupply their ships in the port of Batavia. And to make things worse, Houston actually only had two of her main gun turrets in action, because the third one had earlier been knocked out in a Japanese air attack. So she was already damaged as well, and Perth was the only ship that was actually ready to fight, essentially. So, but by the time they reached Bunton Bay, the Japanese Western Invasion Force had already made it there ahead of them. And the Western Invasion Force, the main portion of that was 27 transports, and they were already landing troops in Bunton Bay when Perth and Houston approached. Now you can see there on that slide, the Japanese escort was very, very heavy. Centerpiece to this escort was these monster-sized cruisers called Megami and Makuma. They were also... Sorry?
I would like to ask that, sorry to jump in,
That's right.
whether Perth or Houston can detect the Japanese ships in the Banten Bay. What has happened? What has happened? Or I mean, Perth and Houston at that time, we believe that it is a modern warship with completed with equipment for detecting. So what has happened at that time?
Okay. Well, in 1942, radar was still very, very primitive. Perth was fitted with a radar set. USS Houston was not. But the radar set in Perth was designed to detect aircraft, and it was very easily confused by clutter in a confined waterway, and Sunda Strait is, of course, a confined waterway. So they did not detect the Japanese. Their lookouts were the only way to detect enemy ships, and they were all very tired. And Waller was only expecting to run into Australian escort ships that were supposed to be guarding Bunton Bay, but they had already retreated unbeknownst to him. So essentially, Perth and Houston are about to run right into the middle of the biggest invasion convoy so far of the war. So the convoy that they were running into were escorted by these two big cruisers, Megami and Makuma, and also a light cruiser called the Notori, and 9 destroyers. And 6 of these destroyers were, as you can see on the screen, of the Fubuki class, and they were very big and very modern and armed to the teeth with torpedoes. As I said before, Houston didn't have any torpedoes and Perth had a few, essentially. But as they closed into Bunton Bay, they were detected by the Fubuki at a reasonably close range, but the Allies didn't see the Fubuki, and she started shadowing. But the Japanese had made a mistake. They weren't expecting the Allied cruisers either, and their escort dispositions were in very, very bad positions. Some of the cruisers and most of the destroyers, they were up to 30 kilometres away, up to the north and up to the west. And the only ships guarding the convoy were 2 destroyers, the Hatakazi and the Harikaze. So Perth first contacted the Harikaze and by signal light interrogated the Japanese ship, thinking she was probably Australian. But very soon it became apparent that she wasn't Australian, and Waller immediately opened fire on her. And USS Houston followed Perth, noting that the Japanese were there because Perth had already opened fire. And that was at around 21:40 at night, so about 20 minutes to 10 at night. But as the Allied ships went after Harikaze, they started seeing transports in the bay slowly as they emerged from the dark. And it slowly dawned on them that they had contacted a Japanese invasion convoy. And the Allies had been trying to intercept one of these convoys for weeks. So here was Waller and Rooks. They had actually done what the Allies had been trying to do for weeks, if only by accident, and found the Japanese whilst they were very vulnerable and landing troops. But the problem was they were already engaged with Japanese warships. And somebody on Perth's bridge as is recorded as saying, there are 4 to starboard, as in 4 ships. There's another 5 ships on the port side. And then, by God, they're all around us. Very soon they realised that they were practically surrounded. But all Perth did was signal to Houston, was follow me. And Houston did exactly that. Houston sent off a radio signal to the US Navy, and it was the last thing that the Allied navies ever heard from Perth or Houston, and it simply said enemy forces engaged. And after that, pretty much the battle was on. The Japanese, as mentioned, were in a very bad position, and the Rear Admiral in charge of the Japanese, Rear Admiral Hara Kenzaburo, he sent his close screening force led by the cruiser Notori and also the destroyers in to engage Perth and Houston at close range. While his larger ships, they approached the battle, but they were a long way away. And for about the first 15 to 20 minutes, the Americans and the Australians were actually the superior force. But there's a common misconception that the Battle of Sunda Strait was a battle fought by two desperate Allied ships, desperately trying to break through the Imperial Japanese Navy to escape. That wasn't the case. Captain Waller was the most experienced combat commander on either side during the entire Java Sea campaign. He had already fought night actions against the Italians, successful night actions too, in the Mediterranean, and he was there to fight. When he opened fire on Harakazi, he went after her. And Captain Rooks in the USS Houston had no hesitation but to do that, to follow them in. But a night action in 1942 was the most confusing thing that a Navy could do. The Americans had decided that it was so hard to do that they tried to avoid it. They didn't train for it. So USS Houston was not trained to fight at night. The Japanese, on the other hand, were highly trained to fight at night, and they actually sought this out. This is exactly what they had trained for. But luckily, the British and Australians had fought night actions in the First World War, and they were also trained as well. And whereas none of the Japanese had fought a night action, Waller certainly had. So it wasn't even by any stage, but it was a fight. It wasn't our ships trying to break through to escape. But a night action was a very confusing, close range affair, even though the visibility on this moonlit night off Bunton Bay was about 6 to 7 nautical miles. One historian has likened the action to similar to a knife fight in a phone booth. So people were fighting at very, very close range, particularly for naval action. It was almost point blank. So it soon developed into a close action. And the Japanese ships were, their commanding officers and their sailors were as brave as any sailors in the world at the time. And they closed in as fast as they could and as close as they could to the British and Australian ships. So very soon, the Australians and Americans found themselves surrounded. The targets were overwhelming. And Perth had been designed to fight battles like this. But she had to split her armament into two. So she had the captain and her gunnery officer fighting the forward armament, and another officer down aft, essentially fighting a very separate battle so they could engage at least two targets at once. Houston didn't have that luxury because, as I said before, she wasn't designed to fight these type of close battles. So she did the best she could with her main armament. But being at night, you have to see where you're shooting at. So half of the secondary armament, 4-inch guns on Perth, were firing illumination shells. So they would fire up into the air behind the Japanese to release parachute flares. And these flares would illuminate the targets for the main armament back on the ships. And while the other half of the armament was their crews were engaging Japanese destroyers at close range in independent control. They were firing over open sights with nobody telling them what to do. It was pretty obvious what to do.
And do you want me to play the video? Do you want me to play the video now so they can see the 4-inch guns?
Yes, you can. The footage you're about to see is shot on a British ship, but these are the type of 4-inch guns that that Perth was fitted with. So half the crews were illuminating the enemy, and the other half were trying to fight off the enemy destroyers as well. And USS Houston's armament was doing exactly the same thing. Doesn't seem to be wanting to play.
I'm sorry, it's not going to play. I'm really sorry about that.
Just go to the next slide, please, Natalie. That's a photograph of the inside of one of the main armament turrets. This turret is actually in a museum in New Zealand, in Auckland. It's off a very similar British cruiser. But as I said, the battle had developed into a very, very close range affair. And the Japanese, their primary weapon was the torpedo. And as I said before, their ships were absolutely armed to the teeth. But you can see there by this slide, this is what the Japanese thought the action looked like. It was very, very confused. Essentially, nobody will know exactly who did what. Even though both sides attempted to recreate the action afterwards, nobody will ever know. So with all the smoke and the darkness and the explosions and the shell splashes, the parachute flares, and the Japanese were also using the world's best searchlights on any ship in the world to illuminate their targets. So it was extremely confused.
Peter.
But the next slide up. Sorry?
Peter, do you mean during at that time, Japanese already planned the attack after the Battle of Java Sea? I mean, they already follow the two ships, or
no.
What is the scenario?
Japanese intelligence lost track. Their reconnaissance, I should say, lost track of Perth and Houston. They were not expecting Perth and Houston in Sunda Strait. And Admiral Hara had his ships, as I said before, up to 30 miles away from his transports. These transports are full of Japanese soldiers. The Japanese soldiers cannot fight Allied warships. So essentially the Japanese were caught. They were caught out very badly. Their planning was poor. And the whole battle developed as the Japanese scrambling to try to get their forces into place to be able to defend these transports. And they're very lucky that the Allied ships went after their warships and fought a conventional battle instead of steering straight into Bunton Bay and sinking half of their transports. But this is a painting of Perth in action on the slide, and with a quote from the captain of the Japanese cruiser Makuma. Everybody thought it was very confusing. The Japanese were having a lot of trouble closing to short range to fire their torpedoes. On many occasions, the Japanese destroyers that closed Perth were driven off by massive amounts of shell fire, shell splashes. They got to the point where they were about to launch their torpedoes and they'd be hit and they'd have to turn away. But the Japanese kept coming. And if you see from the next slide, you'll see how many torpedoes the Japanese fired at Perth and Houston during the action. It was a total of 85, 42 at Perth and 43 at Houston. And some of these ranges, if you have a look at one down there at 1,900 metres, that in naval terms, that is point blank. That is almost alongside the enemy. It sounds like a long way, but it's really not. And the other salvo that you see underlined there at Houston, I'll talk a little bit more about that later. That was fired by Megami. But essentially, those torpedoes would eventually overwhelm the Allied ships. But unbeknownst to the Japanese, Perth was actually fitted with a sonar system to detect these torpedoes coming in. So for the majority of the action, Captain Waller was informed which way the torpedoes were coming from, and he would calmly turn to avoid them. But eventually, the Japanese were coordinating their attacks more and more, and there were just simply too many torpedoes. So just before midnight, Perth is almost out of ammunition. A turret at the front of the ship has run out of 6-inch ammunition. B turret is only firing practice shells, which have got no explosive in them. X and Y turret have only got a little bit of ammunition left, and the 4-inch guns have almost run out of ammunition as well, because the ammunition supply to the guns has been damaged and the personnel feeding the ammunition to the guns have been killed or injured. So their gunners are running out of ammunition. Now, it's only at this point, essentially out of ammunition and no longer a viable combat platform, only now does Waller decide to turn and try to make a break through Sunda Strait. So he turns the ship, he increases speed up to 28 knots, working up to full speed. And it's at this point that the Harikaze has fired torpedoes from 1,900 metres, and one of her torpedoes hits Perth right in the forward engine room unit. So her forward boiler room and her forward engine room. And this essentially cripples the ship and reduces her speed to 23 knots. Waller is heard to exclaim on the bridge, "That's torn it." In other words, we can't escape now. And soon after that, Perth is hit by another torpedo, up forward, just underneath the magazines that hold, which would have held the ammunition, but she's now empty, of course. So with 2 torpedo hits, Waller orders abandon ship and for the men to try and get in the water and to be able to save themselves. But unfortunately for Waller, he was hit by a shell waiting on the bridge for his men to be able to escape. And very soon after, Perth was hit by a 3rd torpedo and then a 4th torpedo before she sinks. She sinks at about 20 minutes past midnight on the 1st of March. And she had been in action for approximately an hour, fighting with Houston, a very large Japanese force. Now, USS Houston at this point, she is also heavily damaged. Both of her main turrets are out of action, so none of her heavy guns are in action. And by now, the Makuma and the Megami are on site and they are fighting her with their 8-inch guns. But only reduced down to a couple of secondary armament, Captain Rooks decides to turn his ship, with Perth now sunk, he decides to turn his ship into Bunton Bay and to charge the Japanese transports to try and sink as many as he can. Unfortunately, he doesn't make it. Houston is also overwhelmed. After being hit by 3 torpedoes, Rooks also orders abandon ship, but he is then killed by shrapnel on his bridge as well. A 4th torpedo fired by a Japanese destroyer finally sinks Houston, and she sinks about 20 to 25 minutes after the Perth is sunk. And it's at that stage, essentially, that the battle for Sunda Strait has ended. But there's one part to go. This is the Dutch destroyer Evertsen. As mentioned before, she's crewed by mostly Dutch officers, but primarily an Indonesian crew. She has followed the Australians and Americans to Sunda Strait, but when she gets there, all she sees is flares and gunfire. She tries to evade the Japanese forces, but she is discovered after Houston is sunk by 2 Japanese destroyers, the Shirakumo and the Murakumo, and she essentially is battered into a wreck. She cannot take on these 2 Japanese destroyers. They're just too powerful. And she is run up on an island, actually, Sabuku Island, at the head of Sunda Strait. And she's abandoned by her crew. But luckily for her, her crew are able to step off onto the land, essentially. They don't end up in the water like the Americans and the Australians. But as far as the Allied casualties go, the casualties have been quite heavy. So Perth has lost 353 men killed, 328 survived the sinking, and they become prisoners of war. And Houston, she has also had 693 men killed, and 368 survived to end up as prisoners of war. The damage on the Japanese side, both the Allied ships hit the destroyers that were coming in close, but they didn't do crippling damage. But the Japanese have lost 4 transports and a minesweeper, but they have been lost to what proved to be the most effective torpedo salvo of the entire war, and it was fired at Houston. The Japanese cruiser Mogami fired 6 massive Type 93 torpedoes. The Type 93 is the biggest torpedo in the world at the time with the longest range. Very, very fearsome weapon for the day. But they've missed Houston, and these torpedoes have run past Houston into Bunton Bay, and they've sunk 5 of their own ships, including the headquarters ship for the Japanese general who's in charge of the landing operation. So unfortunately, General Imamura Hitoshi, he spends the first few hours of his invasion floating around in the water in a life jacket until he's rescued by another Japanese ship. Very embarrassing for the Japanese Navy. The Japanese Navy did apologise to the Japanese Army for that, but it was a direct result of the very confused nature of the battle. And that pretty much sums it up. But this is a painting of Hector Waller. We have one of our submarines named after him now. And as I mentioned before, he was one of the greatest fighting leaders that we've ever produced in our Navy. He was 42 years of age when he was killed in that battle. But it was not a battle where our ships were trying to escape. They found the Japanese and they fought the Japanese until they couldn't fight them anymore. And incidentally, this was the first battle that the Australian Navy and the US Navy had ever fought, the first time they'd ever fought together. So the Australians and the Japanese and the Americans spent the next 4 years fighting the Japanese. and our navies have been operating together ever since. So the actual foundation of the relationship that the Australian Navy and the US Navy have got today, 80 years later, including, as you said before, Australian and American naval officers in Bunton Bay on an Indonesian warship today, it all stems back from this one action in Sunda Strait, where both navies looked at the other navy and realised how professional and how good fighting units that they had.
Peter, what happened with the survivors from
With
Perth?
the survivors, they were look, the survivors. Some of them made it ashore and were captured by the Japanese army. The most were rescued from the water by the Japanese Navy, and they were treated very well by the Japanese Navy until they were handed over to the Japanese army, and then not so much. But prisoners, the whole prisoner of war area isn't really a discussion for today, but essentially 106 of our men did die as prisoners of war before they were repatriated to Australia at the end of the war.
Another survivor? Was there any other survivor?
No, there was.
We heard about patriotic cat.
You heard about what? Sorry.
Cat.
The patriotic cat, red lead.
The patriotic cat.
Yes, the cat isn't my area of expertise, but there was a cat. A lot of ships back in that period had pets on board, and red lead had come aboard the ship once in I believe Alexandria in Egypt, and the crew had adopted him. Yeah, he didn't survive the battle, and that's about all I know about the cat. But the cat, yeah, you are right. The cat did fight the Battle of Sunda Strait along with the crew of Perth and Houston.
It's also an interesting story how the cat got its name, because it was locked in a paint cupboard and it knocked over the tin of paint, so the story goes, and got the paint on its paw prints, this red lead paint, and stepped it all over the ship when it came out. And go on.
Sorry, red lead was an old undercoat. So all ships were painted, had their undercoat painted with red lead. Highly carcinogenic, and we don't use it anymore.
Yeah, it's very dangerous. It probably wasn't very good for the cat either.
No, but neither was Japanese shellfire.
Today, HMAS Perth 3 has red pussycat paw prints painted on it in honour of red lead.
I can tell you Perth 2 didn't. I don't remember seeing any footprints on Perth. Yeah. Perth 2 was my old ship.
Okay, how deep is it?
Perth lies in about 35 to 37 metres of water, but she's not in Bunton Bay itself. She's offshore a fair bit. Houston's in shallower water. I think it's more like 25 metres. Don't quote me on that because I'm not a diver. She is closer into Bunton Bay, where Captain Rooks steered her towards the Japanese transports before she was overwhelmed.
Peter, what is the most, if I can ask that, what is the most remarkable mark or remarkable feature of HMS Perth that we can recognize easily? I mean, when we go underwater, that, okay, this is Perth. Make it difference with other ships.
Are you talking about the way the wreck looks today?
I mean, what is the most remarkable feature of Perth itself? Yes. To make it easier us now to recognize Perth as
Well, to be honest, Perth has been so heavily salvaged that I would be hard pressed as an expert to recognise much. All of her main recognisable features have all been salvaged. They're gone. Not so much. Not so Houston. Houston's recognisable features. She lies on her side, where she capsized and went down on her side.
How far is it?
Sorry.
How far Perth to Houston?
A couple of nautical miles. I don't know the exact distance. Natalie may know from her studies, but Houston lies on her side, and her 8-inch gun mounts with triple guns, they are still quite recognisable, and her hull is very, very damaged. And obviously, shipwrecks, metal shipwrecks, steel shipwrecks that have spent 80 years on the bottom, they degrade and they start collapsing as well. Houston hasn't completely collapsed, but she's not in very good condition. And torpedo holes, the Japanese torpedoes made very rather large holes in the hull, which also weakened the hull, and corrosion further weakens the hull as well. So, but Houston is still recognisable as a US cruiser,
Yes.
as an American warship. Yes.
Okay, thank you, Peter. Thank you for sharing. Adik-adik, jadi kalau tadi sekilas Peter menyebut soal Pearl Harbor. Jadi ini adalah rangkaian apa yang terjadi di Laut Jawa dengan yang kemudian terkenal dengan Battle of Java Sea, dan kemudian masuk ke Selat Sunda. Itu adalah rangkaian di mana saya yakin adik-adik mengetahui cerita itu, bahwa pangkalan militer Amerika diserang oleh Jepang pangkalan militer Amerika Pearl Harbor diserang oleh Jepang pada awal Desember, itu kalau tidak salah 7 Desember ya, 1942. Itu dalam rangka pendudukan. Nah, pendudukan itu kemudian meluas sampai ke Asia Tenggara. Kemudian sampai ke Jawa. Nah, itulah yang menyebabkan sekutu kemudian bergabung di situ, karena pada saat itu Indonesia masih East India. Nah, bergabung di situ, kemudian merembetlah pertempuran itu di Selat Sunda. Nah, di awal Pak Bambang tadi meng-highlight bahwa pertempuran Laut Jawa dan Selat Sunda itu menandai konstelasi perjuangan menuju kemerdekaan. Nah, dan setelah kejadian pertempuran Selat Sunda di 1 Maret beberapa kapal sekutu tenggelam di situ, Australia, Amerika tenggelam di situ. Di awal minggu kedua bulan Maret 42 itu sekutu kemudian menyerah. Disitulah pendudukan Jepang di Indonesia dimulai pada Maret 1942. Nah, kenapa tadi dikatakan ini yang menandai konstelasi perjuangan kemerdekaan Indonesia? Jadi kalau kita bicara mengenai apakah ada hubungan historik bahwa itu kapal Amerika, kapal Australia, apakah kemudian ada hubungan historik dengan kita? Nah, kejadian-kejadian itu merupakan rangkaian yang mempengaruhi langkah-langkah pemuda-pemuda Nusantara untuk merumuskan seperti apa bagaimana kemudian konstelasi perjuangan itu, perjuangan menuju 1945. Nah, seperti itu. Terima kasih, Peter. Thank you, Peter, and
Thank you.
Thank you for sharing. And we will, Natalie, it is your turn. I think a lot to talk about what has happened after 1942, and then what is the result of what has happened with Perth after lying on the bottom of the Banten Bay, and when we first from time to time what has happened with the wreck, and then what is the significance of the wreck for Australia, and what do you think how do you think Indonesia should evolve, and also what is the future function of the ship? it is no longer function as a warship. As a warship, sure. But we believe that HMS Perth continues her function in a different way. A lot lesson learned. We can pick it up from that one. And okay, Natalie, the screen is yours.
Maaf, masih di mute. Selamat siang semua. Nama saya Natalie Pearson. Saya senang sekali diundang ke presentasi ini di Marine Heritage Gallery oleh rekan dan teman saya Zainab. Thank you, Pete, for such a great presentation. Sebetulnya dia yang ahli sejarah di sini. Pete, I'm just saying that you're the historic expert here. Dan peran saya adalah menjelaskan apa yang terjadi dengan HMAS Perth setelah Perang Dunia Kedua. So it's my job to talk to you about what happened after World War II to HMAS Perth. Dan pentingnya bagi orang Australia dan saya ingin meyakinkan bahwa kapal tenggelam ini juga penting bagi Indonesia juga. So I want to share that it is an important ship for Australia and also try and convince you that it's also an important ship for Indonesia. So I have some pictures too. Can you see my slide, Zainab?
Yeah, it is perfect.
Okay. So I'll speak in English. After HMAS Perth sank in the Battle of Sunda Strait, nothing really happened for 25 years. The prisoners of war spent time in Thailand and Burma building a railway. Some of them were taken to Japan to work in the factories there. It wasn't until 1944 that some of the HMAS Perth survivors were found and brought back to Australia. And it was only then, in 1944, 2 years after the ship sank, that people started to learn the story of what had happened in the Battle of the Sunda Strait. But still, nobody touched the wreck. Nothing happened until 1967, when this man here, can you see my mouse, Sana? Yeah. So his name is David Burchell, or Burchell. Interestingly, he has one leg, if you can see. So he is an Australian diver, a free breath diver. He also was a scuba diver. And he started to read these newspaper articles about diving pirates in Asia Tenggara, in Southeast Asia. And he was worried about HMAS Perth. So he made it his job to go to Indonesia and look for Perth and Houston, because they are quite close. Now, he didn't really need to ask permission, but he still told the authorities. He let the Indonesians know that he was coming, and he also spoke to the Australian Embassy in Jakarta to see if they could help him and to see if there were any rules that he had to follow, any laws. And basically, they didn't really want anything to do with it. So it was up to him to find a boat, to find some Indonesian translators to help him find HMAS Perth and USS Houston. Now, interestingly, the way he found Perth was he went to Teluk Banten and he spoke to the fishermen, because HMAS Perth and USS Houston had become marine ecosystems. They were reefs. They were places that fish were attracted to. And the fish meant that there were birds as well above the wrecks. So David Burchell went to Bunton Bay and spoke to the fishermen and was successful in finding HMAS Perth and USS Houston. Now, this is what he drew. This is, I think, a picture drawn by David Burchell. You can see him here standing. I don't know if he actually did that, Now, he was scuba diving. He wasn't free breath diving. He talked about the sharks that are on the wreck, and you can see that Perth is lying on its side. So it had suffered torpedo damage. I've just noticed this drawing was done by Ray Parkin, not David Burchell, who was on the Perth, actually. So it had suffered some torpedo damage, as you can see, but it was mostly intact. So he made a number of dives to the site by himself. He had support crew on the water above him, but he was the only one going down, and it was his job. He wanted to find the bell. He wanted to find Perth's bell, and he couldn't find it, but he did find some other objects on the wreck, and he brought these up to the surface and put them on the little boat, and eventually he brought them back to Australia. So there's a spotlight here and the binnacle. I think the binnacle is now in our War Memorial in Canberra. But he looked and he looked and he could not find the bells. There were two bells. This is the working bell. You can see it has two names on it. This is the name when it was in the Royal Navy before it joined the Royal Australian Navy. And then on the other side of the working bell, you have its new name in the Royal Australian Navy.
Natalie,
Yep.
so you mean HMS Perth has actually has a first name, her
Yeah.
first name before it turns into the.
That's right.
So it is HMS Amphion.
HMS Amphion when it was in the Royal Navy.
Amphion.
And then it was
Amphion.
Amphion.
Amphion. Is it?
Amphion.
Somebody corrected me once.
I've been pronouncing it wrong for years. That's good to know.
I did for years too. It's not just you.
Amphion. Okay. Well,
Am-
anyway, thank goodness it was renamed Perth because I can pronounce that.
So Amphion and mostly use a Greek god name for
Yeah.
as a sister for this sister ship with Perth,
Yes.
right? Okay.
So it had two other sister ships. There was HMAS Sydney,
Mhm.
and that was also a modified Leander class cruiser, and its first name was HMS Phaeton.
Yep.
Yep. And then the third sister ship was HMAS Hobart, and that ship was originally called HMS Apollo, I think. Apollo, yeah. So interestingly, Perth had two bells, and the story I've heard is that when they first found this bell, they cleaned it and they said, oh, it's the wrong ship. And then someone turned it around and saw the Perth on the back. But here it is. It was recovered by an Indonesian salvage company and returned to the Australian Embassy in Jakarta in 1974. And it is now at the Australian War Memorial in Canberra. There's also, there it is there with the binnacle that I mentioned earlier. So they've been cleaned up a bit. It's only a small cabinet on display, but there was also a second bell. Let me show you this one. This is the ceremonial bell. You can see it's much bigger. It has the oak leaves around I think it's called the shoulder and around the bottom here. This was returned to Australia in the mid-1980s. It's a very long story how it was found and recovered, but I'm pleased to say that it has come back to Australia and it's now on display at the City of Perth in Western Australia. Very big bell, that one. And Zainab, before you asked about the distinguishing features of naval warships, underwater, what can you look for? Well, certainly if you find a ship's bell, you can be very certain of the identity of that ship. But they are highly valuable items because they are so symbolic. Most people on the ship have a relationship with the bell. They hear it every 4 hours. Is that right, Pete?
Well, it was originally every 30 minutes, but we don't do it anymore. It's usually done for ceremonies at 8 o'clock in the morning alongside, but not at sea.
Oh, right. Okay.
Yeah. Everyone's got a watch these days or a phone.
Or an iPhone.
Yeah.
These are some other things that were pulled off the wreck. since David Burchell found it in 1967, he really, it marked the beginning of human visits to the wreck. So the fish had been visiting the wreck for many years, but now David Burchell had found the wreck, the salvagers had found the wreck, and people were starting to visit it. That wasn't necessarily a bad thing because it meant that they could check on it and monitor it. But sometimes things were removed and brought back to Australia. So you can see here these shells and these plates from Perth. And these are held by the Maritime Heritage, I think the Naval Heritage Centre here in Sydney.
They're part of the Naval Heritage Collection on Spectacle Island.
Yeah. And they were just posted to the public service officer there in charge with all this foam to protect them. It was quite a parcel when they opened it and realised what was inside.
Yeah.
So this is a photo of the naval ensign, which is the white flag. Sorry, Pete, if I'm doing that a disservice. Being flown off the wreck of HMAS Perth in 2002. So divers had started to visit the wreck more regularly. Mostly, I understand, as a sign of respect. It's not an easy dive. The water is turbid, so it's not very clear. It's fast moving. It's not necessarily very shallow. It's about 35 meters, 37 meters. So you need to be a pretty experienced diver to get down there. And it did start to attract recreational divers and people with a connection to the wreck and an interest in naval history. And these divers started to notice some suspicious activity on the wreck. So this is X-turret here. I think we saw a photo of that before from Pete. This photo was shared with me by a diver called Andrew Fock. And,
yeah, that's X-turret.
Yeah. And,
Yeah,
and these recreational divers who were visiting Perth on a regular basis started to notice that the wreck was changing, and it wasn't just environmental degradation. They started to notice signs of human interference with the wreck, and they brought their concerns to the attention of Australian authorities in 2013. And they wanted to know why Indonesia and Australia were not working to protect the wreck. But unfortunately, Indonesia and Australia were not working very closely together at that time. I think our relationship is a lot stronger now when it comes to marine heritage. But very sadly, in 2013, we did not have the relationships between people like me and Zainab and Pete and all the other people working hard in the Ministry of Marine Affairs and Fisheries to take the steps necessary to protect Perth from this salvage activity. So after quite a number of years, they had to set up an agreement to work together. They had to get research visas. Finally, in 2017, the Indonesian and the Australian maritime archaeologists were able to do a joint dive on Perth. So you can see Shinatria Adityatama here from Arkanas, and he has dived on Perth quite a number of times. In 2016, Indonesia did a multi-beam scan of HMAS Perth and noticed that there were some concerning changes to the wreck site. And finally, in 2017, the Indonesians and Australians were able to go down to the wreck in person and do a joint survey. And unfortunately, what they found was absolutely devastating. So I showed you that the wreck was intact, largely intact when it sank. But what they found is that HMAS Perth had been heavily salvaged, not just taking small things like the bell or the binnacle or the light or the plates, but huge chunks of the ship, more than more than half of the ship had been taken. So this was salvage on a commercial, industrial scale. And as Pete explained, 353 Australian men died on Perth. So that means that when the ship was salvaged, their human remains were desecrated, and no respect was shown to their human remains. So it was a very devastating time for Australian communities, for the survivors who were still alive, for their descendants, and for all of those people who care about HMAS Perth. This is one of the salvage barges working above HMAS Perth in 2015, before Indonesia and Australia were able to do the joint dive. And it was probably around this time that most of the ship, well, half of the ship was removed. So they were stealing it for scrap metal. And David Burchell had been worried about this in 1967. So it's very sad that in 2015, we weren't able to do something to stop this happening. You can see, I think these are shells on the seabed here, 4-inch shells. That's from the joint dive in May 2017. So this is a schematic or a picture of what Perth looked like in 1967 when David Burchell dived on it. You can see the torpedo damage, and a few pieces are missing, but it's largely intact. This is what it was starting to look like in 2009. You can see that the propellers have been removed. They're worth a lot of money because they're made from bronze.
They went in the mid to late 70s, allegedly.
Mid to late 70s. And then this is what it looked like, they understand, in 2013. And then by the time they did the joint dive, this is what the ship looked like. So you can see just how much of it has gone. It
is more than 50%, right? Gone.
Yeah, that's right. So that's it in 1967 at the top. And then they did another dive in 2019, actually, but most of the damage was done between 2013 and 2017.
What do you think the reason? Why is that? Not only in Indonesia, it is also happening in Southeast Asia. The salvage for warship is quite massive. What do you think? I mean, the reason of the salvagers. They just took the hull or what part of the ship, but are they valuable?
Well, some of the valuable objects had been picked off strategically in the 1960s and 70s, and they were the bells, the propellers, as Pete said. I'm trying to think what else. Just bits and pieces.
Non-ferrous metal, essentially, like in your gun mountings, etc. A lot of the steel and the metal they used in construction of these things were non-ferrous. It wasn't just iron. The post-Second World War, for decades, the price of steel was actually quite high, because you can imagine how much steel got used during the Second World War. So it was a very, very big market for scrap metal, but not just iron, just not normal steel. It was all the non-ferrous stuff. So if you cracked open an engine room in a ship, a lot of the boiler tubes, a lot of things made out of bronze, phosphor bronze, manganese, copper. They were quite valuable. So salvagers would go into the engine room of a ship and blow it up with TNT, wait for the dust to settle, literally, and go back and take all this stuff. So the other things taken off Perth in that period were the phosphor bronze propellers and the propeller bosses, because they were worth a lot of money. But what we saw in this century, between 2013 and 17, that was something completely different. That was going after everything.
What about the wiring, Pete? Is that something they would have pulled out as well? No, not so much? No. Okay.
Not so much, no. But the boiler tubes, that photograph you showed of the wreckage on the deck, that was a few slides ago. they're boiler tubes, all
Right.
the little stringy bits that you saw.
Yeah. Okay, that's great. Thank you. I'm learning along with all of you.
Yeah, all that stuff in the bottom left, and you can just see the remains of probably an auxiliary boiler, just a little bit mid upper left, I suppose.
Okay. But as Pete said, by 2013, it was indiscriminate, just taking scrap metal. Some people believe, and it's quite a popular theory, that this metal is attractive because it has low radiation. It was made before, Hiroshima and Nagasaki nuclear explosions. And it's lain at the bottom of the sea for 80 years, for 70 years. Some people think that is why these World War II wrecks are so valuable and are being targeted. But I don't know if I agree with that. I think that is it's a popular theory because it's interesting with radiation and the nuclear era. But the reality is, I think that to process this scrap metal, you can see how rusted and corroded it is. You're going to reintroduce radiation in that process anyway. So I think it's just been stolen purely for its scrap metal value, not because it's low radiation. I think if you look at the price of iron ore in, there's a great demand for steel in China, and even just basic scrap metal purposes, I think that is the attraction of these wrecks.
Look, there is a history allegedly of using scrap metal from warships sunk prior to 1945. They were normally talking about the armor plate. So not just the general ship structure. The general ship structure was this thick. The armor plate on Perth, on her belt, was 4 inches of non-cemented, specially hardened armor. As Natalie says, maybe, but the rest of the ship, no, not for nuclear anything.
Yeah. So, look, this was obviously a very having experienced that tragedy of the battle of the Java Sea and then the battle of the Sunda Strait. So many men died, so many men taken as prisoners of war. What happened in 2013, 2017 was just very tragic. Another blow for Perth and for her legacy. And I think it led to, a lot of disappointment and anger, frustration that things couldn't have happened faster to protect Perth. But at the same time, the story I want to tell today is that the joint dive represented Indonesia and Australia finally working together after so many years of Perth being in Indonesian waters. Perth, her wartime service was only 3 years, and she's been in Indonesian waters for 80 years. So she is a shared burden, a shared responsibility, a shared legacy for both countries. And finally, in 2017, we started working together to see what we could do with what was left. And it was the results of this survey in 2017 that led to Ibu Susi Pujiastuti, who you can see here, the Minister of Marine Affairs and Fisheries. In 2018, here she is above the waters of HMAS Perth in Bunton Bay, throwing a wreath with a descendant, George Hatfield, a representative from the Indonesian Navy, and the Australian ambassador. And they are throwing a wreath into the water. And Ibu Susi used that opportunity in 2018, on 28th of February, to declare that HMAS Perth was Indonesia's first Kawasan Konservasi Maritim, first maritime conservation zone. So that's really significant for Indonesia. The interesting thing is that Perth was not listed as a cultural heritage site. it was listed as a marine conservation site. So this is recognising that Perth has cultural heritage values, but it also has values in terms of the marine ecosystem that it supports and how it should be managed for the future. Zainab, feel free to jump in if you want on that point. So here is the Kawasan Konservasi Maritim. You can see, of course, all of you know where Bunton Bay is, but this is one of the maps, and here's Pulau Panjang, and Perth is up here. I can't see very well on my screen, I'm afraid, but it is up there. Yeah, so that's the conservation zone, listed in 2018, and this is from the legislation, the decree, the ministerial decree, outlining the site. Now, interestingly, and makes it a bit complicated for people like Zainab, the Marine Conservation Zone was announced by Ibu Susi, who is a national minister, but the responsibility for managing the marine zone is Banten Province, Provinsi Banten. So the legislation is at the national level, but implementation is at provincial level. So it's a little bit complicated. What the Banten Province have come up with, this great picture, is there are two zones within the Maritime Conservation Zone. There is the core zone, Zona Inti, and as you can see, the activities are very limited, and you can only access the wreck with permission. It's highly regulated, and you're only allowed to access the wreck for things like supervision patrols and research, and non-extractive development, and education activities, so research. And then around that core zone, there is a wider zone of limited use, permanfaatan terbatas, and that is so that people can go fishing, for bigger supervision, for marine tourism, for religious ceremonies, like we saw today with throwing the wreath above the water, for those sort of activities. So this is actually, the results of the survey were very disappointing, but it led to something positive for Perth, which is this marine conservation zone. And I think Zainab or maybe Nia shared with me this photo of the fish on Perth. And I just wanted to mention some of the local communities who live around Perth, on Pulau Panjang. I had hoped to visit these communities in 2020 to learn more about their understanding of Perth. But because of COVID, I can't get there yet. But these fishing communities, they are fishing for lobsters and anchovies. They make their living from fishing in Bunton Bay. And I think, these communities sit very close to where Perth is and have an important role in the future, in protecting the wreck, alerting authorities of suspicious activities. And given that the responsibility for managing Perth has fallen to Bunton Province, they're also interested in finding out how they can benefit from the wreck. And that's not in a way that is exploiting the wreck, but in a way that is a sustainable way of living with the wreck in their waters, I think. So these are some of the fishing, aquaculture in Bunton Bay. And I think for these local communities and for the Bunton officials, it's really important to try and think about Perth and do justice to her legacy by contextualizing her within Bunton Bay's maritime history. So this is a picture from a map from the 16th century. The Portuguese were in Bunton, and there was a big battle there with the Dutch, and the Dutch won, as we know, and stayed in Indonesia for another 300 years or so. But one of the Dutch ships that was involved in that battle was actually the first Dutch ship to come to Australia, to Western Australia, the Dovken. And a replica of that little vessel is now at the Australian National Maritime Museum in Sydney. So it's really interesting to think about all the connections between Bunton and Australia, even before Perth. And I think adding that extra maritime history context and that extra local community context is really important for how we think about Perth for the future. Finally, legacy for Australian communities. This is Perth's last living survivor. I took this photo 2 days ago in Sydney. Frank McGovern, he is wearing his Prisoner of War medals, and he was given an Order of the Medal of Australia. I think that's what it's called, OAM. OAM, and all his war service medals here. So Perth is, you know, it's a big legacy that he is carrying. He's carrying the stories of the 680 men who are no longer alive. A lot of people have been looking to him in the last few days, and he holds all the memories of this ship. And I think it's really important that we keep trying to raise awareness about Perth, about the men who served on her, and also about Perth's role in Indonesian history as well. As Zainab said, it precipitated, first of all, the Japanese occupation, and then ultimately Indonesian independence. So I just wanted to pay tribute to the last survivor and to other descendants who still care so much about Perth in Australia. This is George Hatfield. His father died on HMAS Perth, and he never met his father. George was born 3 months after Perth sank. He attended a service at the Anzac War Memorial in Sydney yesterday, and he's very proud of his father's service. And he wants Indonesia and Australia to be able to work together for what remains of Perth in the future. This is Perth's crew. That photo was taken in August 1941 and is the most iconic photo of Perth, I think, that you will see. And this is a very Australian wreath. This is Australian wattle, bunga bunga Australia. I don't think you get that in Indonesia, do you? I've never seen it in Indonesia. And these are some of the beautiful ways that Australians have paid tribute to Perth in the past, with these stained glass windows down at the chapel at Garden Island in Sydney, and some of the poems written by the prisoners of war, Vic Duncan. So this is finally a plaque at the Australian Embassy in Jakarta. I haven't really mentioned USS Houston, but of course it is the eternal companion of HMAS Perth. And it was a privilege to see that the Indonesians today hosted representatives from Australia and America on their vessel in Bunton Bay. Zainab, did you want to ask a question?
I just want to give a comment. It is beautiful poem at the same set at the same time. As you said that we designated HMS Perth, and we hope that USS Houston would be the next one as a maritime conservation zone. It relates to them the function. I mean, the role of the HMS Perth after years lying on the bottom of the sea, and also how the day-to-day management goes to the local government by hoping the involvement, the local government actively involved in managing the sites, and also they are the closest neighborhood for the closest neighbor for the wreck.
Exactly.
And adik-adik seperti biasa bahwa yang terdekat adalah yang terdekat, tetangga terdekatlah yang bisa menjaga kita. Nah, begitupun filosofi dari manajemen kawasan konservasi maritim. Kenapa meskipun pemerintah pusat yang ada di Jakarta menetapkan kawasan konservasi itu, tapi yang mengelola adalah pemerintah daerah. Bahwa kita yang di Jakarta akan akan jauh aksesnya ke Banten dibanding dengan orang-orang Banten sendiri. Jadi itulah kenapa pengelolaannya ada di pemerintah Banten. Regulasi kita, our policy goes to our policy is even though we stated the national government stated as designated as a conservation zone, but the day-to-day management we share responsibility to manage the site. At the same time that we share responsibility with Australia, with Australian government, with Australian people to protect the site as part our shared heritage, or we share history behind the sites, behind the wreck.
Let me finish up then, Zainab, and we can have some questions maybe.
Yep.
But I just wanted to
already.
Yeah. So I just wanted to share this last. I think it's my last picture. It's my daughter actually with a red lead at the War Memorial, and for me, part of Perth's legacy is being able to share her story with the next generation. So at the War Memorial in Canberra, they have, you can go around the gallery and learn about animals in war. And of course, red lead is an important part of that story. And when they did the tour of the War Memorial, the guide stopped outside the HMAS Perth cabinet and said, "Does anybody know the name of the cat on red lead?" And my daughter put her hand up, and she knew the cat's name, of course. It's a very engaging story, and she was awarded this HMAS Perth hat. But what's lovely today is that there are more students, and this time they're Indonesian, learning about the legacy of HMAS Perth. So that's incredibly special for me that this awareness raising is taking place not just in Australia, but also in Indonesia. And Zainab, I want to thank you for that, for organising this. And then finally, the last legacy for Perth, I think it's a great lesson for Australia that we need to actively engage coastal states, foreign nations. There are other Australian warships in foreign waters outside Australia's territorial waters. And Australia has engaged with Turkey and with Papua New Guinea for the two submarines, AE1 and AE2. But Australia hasn't really actively engaged any other countries. And I think, HMAS Canberra is one ship, for example, that sits outside Australian waters that Australia should be seeking to proactively engage the coastal state over. And there are other, I think there's HMAS Armidale near Timor. So there are a lot of Australian warships, and I think this is what's happened to HMAS Perth is a real lesson for Australia in establishing those people-to-people links, developing mutual trust and respect for each other, and really, proactively engaging with each other so that we can respond quickly when situations like what happened in 2013 happen. And, many people say it's too little too late for HMAS Perth, and I can understand that perspective. But I think there are still lessons to be taken into the future for Perth and for other warships. And yeah, I think I'll leave it there. Zainab, I want to thank you for running the session, and I think Pete and I are happy to answer any questions.
We can read. Thank you, Natalie. Thank you for the wonderful share. How significant the wreck it is for Australia and also Indonesia, and what is the current situation of them? What is the current condition of the wreck? And and policies on it, and what can we do for the future. Thank you for sharing that. And we're running out the time, and there are some questions here on the chat room. What is the use of amphion? Amphion. What is the use of amphion? My guess is what is the use of the bell, or what is the meaning of what is the use of the bell, and why it is marked with the amphion, and also what is the next question still related? What is I think Pete already mentioned the use of the bell for worship, but you can say that again.
Well, the use of a bell, it went back to sailing days where nobody had a watch or an iPhone, and the bell, the whole 24-hour period was broken up into 30-minute segments. And depending on how many numbers of bells they rang, you knew exactly what time it was, and that was using an hourglass with sand in it. So at the wheel or on the bridge, they would turn the hourglass every 30 minutes and they'd ring the bell. And depending on what number it was, that was what time it was. But over centuries, that became, even when you didn't need to do that anymore, the use of the bell had become a sailor's tradition. Okay. So we use the bell now just for ceremonial. So that bell on a ship, and modern ships still carry these bells in, I think, probably all navies. They are they're a focal point of the ship.
I've heard them described as the ship's soul.
Yeah, you could call them that. Yeah, but when a shipwreck is discovered, it's one of the most valuable. A friend of mine, John Perryman, likes to call it a touchstone. Yeah. So, for instance, sitting in the Australian War Memorial, there is not much of Perth, but her bell sits in the War Memorial. Now, you can't physically touch it because you'll get in trouble, but it's part of the ship that served through the ship, served with the crew, and it also went through the final battle in Sunda Strait. And it sits in a museum for anyone to be able to see. So that's why those bells are quite important.
I have been to an exhibition in Portsmouth in England at the naval dockyards there.
The place that HMS Perth built.
Yes, where it was built actually. Yes. But there is a bell, and I can't remember the ship.
HMS Hood.
Oh, it's Hood, of course, and it's a big bell, and you can touch it, and people do. People love to touch the bell. It's literally a touchstone object. One other thing I want to add to Pete's very good explanation about the bells is sometimes if there was time or if they were worried about the ship going down, they would remove the bells. And I think David Burchell thought that Perth's bells might have been removed, which is why, he couldn't find them, but he wasn't convinced that salvagers had got them. He thought maybe they had been disembarked before Perth left Fremantle.
Perth actually landed tons of equipment in Fremantle because she was in she had too much top weight. During the war, they'd put so much into the ship, and if your ship is top heavy, then it's not stable in heavy weather, or if it's damaged. They landed everything, including curtain rods and curtains from the officers' cabins, but they did not land the bells. Yeah. No captain would ever land the bells. His superstitious crew would have hung him. Yeah. Burchell probably didn't understand that.
Thank you, Pete, Natalie. And there is a question too. Natalie, I haven't read the report yet, but how about the anchor? Are they still exist?
Yeah, I think on one of those pictures I showed, it showed that the anchor had been removed. Pete, do you know any more about that?
Well, the anchors are certainly gone now. Now, that part of the ship suffered catastrophic damage from the second hit, which is from a Type 90 Japanese torpedo either fired by Shurikumo or Murakumo. So that part of the ship had suffered a lot of damage, including... Sorry, we seem to have lost...
Oh, no, yeah. I'm just going to try and pull up the picture. Can you see
okay. The one from Parkin. The damage The damage in 2009 was quite extensive. And you see that drawing there at the front of the ship? That's quite conservative. The imagery that I've seen from Andrew Fock was it was actually probably a good deal worse.
Yeah.
So, yeah, that area of the ship was heavily damaged, and I believe there's a good chance that the anchors probably would have ran out.
It is the stern part, right?
No, the bow part. I can't.
Oh, the bow part.
Point at it. So on the right-hand side of that diagram, that's the bow. But there is a chance of that damage, that torpedo damage, that the anchors may have gone over the side during the fight while the ship was sinking. I'm not 100% sure when the anchors were salvaged, but they were definitely salvaged at some point. They're long gone.
Okay, thank you, Pete. Another question. This is from Owen. How did Japanese attack Perth and Houston without getting seen? Again, about the communication equipment and radar.
Well, they did get seen. It was a very bright moonlit night, and visibility for night was quite extensive. But it depends where a ship is in relation to the moon and how the light's playing on. Is the ship in silhouette or is it not in silhouette? When the Japanese closed on Perth and Houston, they were definitely seen. They were illuminated by illumination shells. And put it this way, the Australian and all of the gunners, Australians, Americans, Japanese, they could see what they were shooting at. It was not pitch black.
Okay. Thank you, Pete. Natalie, some interesting questions on the chat box. This is how future generations, how young generations can help in conservation for the underwater cultural heritage, and specifically on HMS Perth. And the second one is what is actually the positive impact that we can take from this battle? And would you think that the legacy will live on for many years in the future, and how to keep it alive in the future, and the involvement of next generation for this? Thank you.
Thank you. That's a nice question. I can't see it in the chat, but Zainab, just remind me if I forget one of them. I think the next generation has a really important role to play. And Zainab and I actually last year ran an online course with Indonesian tertiary students from universities across Indonesia in Sumatra, Java and Sulawesi, bringing together Indonesian students to learn more about HMAS Perth within the context of Indonesia's underwater cultural heritage. Indonesia, at the crossroads of the South China Sea and the Indian Ocean, is home to who knows how many shipwrecks. I mean, we don't know, do we? Hundreds, thousands. And so we ran this course and used it to share information about Perth, and also to get the students to think about their own response to how to manage underwater cultural heritage in Indonesia for the future. And some of the students looked at different parts of Indonesia. There was some of the students looked at specific sites in Sulawesi, but one group actually from Banten, from the University Untirta, chose to develop a concept for an exhibition at their university on HMAS Perth. And it was really innovative. They had even identified the venue at the university and come up with what they wanted the exhibition to look like. They had plans to borrow one of the bells and put it on display there. So, you know, that would be amazing if we could run an exhibition like that with the initiative of those students. But even the simple fact of running the course and connecting students across Indonesia to talk about things that perhaps, even though they were interested in archaeology or history education, maybe they didn't know about this Australian wreck in their own backyard, basically. So I think, you know, continuing this education process, today's activity is one of those sort of things as well, through exhibitions, through storytelling, and through thinking about different perspectives on the wreck. And you know, if you think about how our understanding of Perth has changed over the years, it's really widened now, and we've got a much broader contextual view of how Indonesia fits into the story as well. And then the next question was about the benefits of the battle. I mean, if you ask the survivors or the descendants, I don't think they'd say there are any benefits, because the men who did come home were shattered men. It was the defining event for many of them of their entire lives. And it makes me really sad that we are commemorating the 80th anniversary of Perth today and Houston, and the world is still at war, and we are experiencing so much conflict all around the world. So, you know, I would like to say that one of the legacies has been a stronger appreciation of the futility of war, but I don't know if that's the case. I think the main benefit is, the first one for Australia is thinking about how to manage other wrecks for the future, realising that Australia needs to be proactively engaging with other countries. And then I would like to see benefits for the local communities living with this wreck or these wrecks in their waters, through the development of perhaps a site interpretation centre on maybe Pulau Panjang, maybe a local museum. I know local authorities in Bunton would love to build a museum that integrates Bunton's maritime history, its Islamic history, its amazing mangroves, HMAS Perth, and brings them all together in a museum that really does justice to all these different aspects of Bunton Bay. That's for the future, I hope, future collaboration.
Thank you, Natalie. I would like, we're running out time. We will have an extra 5 minutes. I will invite 2 students would like to interact directly. Any? Anyone from Highfield or from Santa Ursula?
Are these all local high schools, Aina?
Yes, some national and international school from here in Jakarta, Depok, and surroundings Jakarta. And okay, any? Okay, Ataya.
Okay.
Please turn your screen, Ataya. Turn on your, yes, turn on. Thank you.
Oh.
To Peter or to Natalie? You are mute, Ataya.
Wait, please, I'm still changing the virtual background. So my name is Ataya Kemal Altaf from Highfield Depok. I'd like to ask several questions about the Battle of Sunda Strait. Is it possible?
Shoot.
Yes, carry on.
So previously I have researched some parts of the Battle of Java Sea, but I think for the Battle of Sunda Strait, there are still some parts for me personally, it's a bit confusing. Because I think the Dutch have a military presence in that area, why are the Dutch not like only has one destroyer at a time?
The Dutch Navy at the time.
Can't hear you all of a sudden, Pete. And like you're very soft. Have you got your hand over your mic or something?
No.
Oh yeah, that's better. That's better.
Is that better? I just turned it off and on. Look, the Dutch only had very small naval forces in the Netherlands East Indies in 1942. They'd lost a majority of their forces in Europe when that Hitler guy kind of took their country over at short notice. The forces that were left out in Indonesia weren't extensive, and they also suffered losses helping the British try to defend Singapore. So the Battle of Java Sea was the last throw of the dice. They'd already had a number of ships damaged. Ships had escaped to Australia. Some actually fought for the majority of the rest of the war in either Australia or in Ceylon with the British. So the main striking force that was left was De Ruyter and Java, Kortner, Evertson, and that was pretty much about it. So when the Dutch lost those 2 cruisers in the space of about 3 minutes in the Battle of the Java Sea, that was essentially the main force of the remaining Dutch ships left that were gone. And Evertson was just one more ship that was trying to escape. And that was why. And Evertson didn't play a role because she didn't receive her orders in time. And when Waller was signalled to her and said, "Come on, mate, we've got to go," he hadn't even her CO hadn't even raised steam yet. And with a steam ship, it would take hours to light the boilers and raise steam pressure to be able to proceed to sea.
Semoga jelas ya, Ataya ya. Nah, untuk adik-adik sebagai informasi ya, ada situasi, ada kondisi yang cukup menyedihkan ya, cukup menyedihkan untuk peninggalan Battle of Java Sea. Jadi hampir semua kapal-kapal perang yang tenggelam pada saat Battle of Java Sea itu milik Belanda, Amerika, Inggris itu hilang karena ada illegal salvage, diangkat secara ilegal. Nah, itu cukup itu baik sebenarnya. Kita Indonesia pernah diprotes. Indonesia pernah diprotes oleh Belanda karena itu adalah war grave mereka yang ada di perairan kita. Nah, dan kemudian hilang. Nah, itulah yang menandai kemudian momen itu kemudian yang menandai bahwa negara-negara harus bekerja sama untuk raising awareness tentang pentingnya peninggalan bersejarah yang ada di perairan kita untuk kita jaga bersama, untuk kita kerjasamakan, untuk kita bahu-membahu antara bukan hanya Indonesia tapi juga dengan Australia, Amerika, Inggris, dengan Inggris untuk menjaga itu, dan memberikan fungsi baru tentunya, karena wreck itu menjadi artificial reef. Kalau one day adik-adik jalan-jalan ke Pulau Panjang, pasti akan ketemu dengan fisherman yang menyampaikan bahwa wreck itu adalah dulu kami selalu memancing di situ. Kami menangkap ikan di satu spot, dan itu banyak sekali ikan di situ. Yang ternyata mereka tidak sadari bahwa ada kapal besar di bawahnya yang yang membentuk satu ekosistem baru di bawah. So, itu kenapa kita tetapkan kawasan konservasi maritim instead of cultural heritage, karena ini mengcombine antara ekosistem baru yang menjadi bagian dari laut itu sendiri, tapi pada saat yang sama memiliki nilai historik yang tinggi. Nah, ada lagi pertanyaan? Sebelum masuk ke kuis, kakak-kakak yang ada, Kak Tenti, Yuki, itu ada kuis untuk adik-adik. But it is fun. We can play with. Ada lagi pertanyaan? Kalau tidak ada yang raise hand, sesi ini saya akhiri. This is the end of our session. Oh, okay. Very short question, Marcy. Before we close the session and go to the quizzes, please.
Sorry, I would just like to ask. It's basically more of out of pure curiosity. It's not really related to the Battle of Sunda Strait, but are there any other Navy ships that are sunken here, like from Australia or from America, here in Indonesia, other than Perth and Houston?
There were other wrecks, but unfortunately, as I believe Zani just explained, most of them were salvaged, as in they're gone. As far as Australian ships go, no, it was only Perth directly in Indonesian territorial waters. There are other ships sunk close to Indonesia, so in the Arafura Sea and mainly off northwestern Australia. But no, I'm not aware of any that are actually left in Indonesian waters except for Perth. But there were other nationalities: American ships, British ships, Japanese ships, a lot of merchant ships. Those ships that were sunk in Bunton Bay, most of them were salvaged even during the war by the Japanese. So there's no shipwrecks left in Bunton Bay, except to the best of my knowledge. Please excuse me if I'm wrong. Except for Perth and Houston.
Terima kasih, Pi. Thank you, Pi. Untuk adik-adik, menyambung pertanyaan Marcy, ada berapa selain kapal Australia dan Amerika yang tercatat di kita. Ada 46 warship. Ada 46 warship yang tercatat ya. Ini belum yang kami percaya ada lebih banyak dari itu. Itu tersebar di Laut Jawa. Kalau Laut Jawa terang ya. Itu tadi ada di Sunda Strait, ada di Java Sea, ada di timur Indonesia, ada di Sulawesi Utara, ada di Papua. Itu lokasi-lokasi pertempuran Pasifik, Perang Dunia Kedua. Nah, disitulah banyak spot-spot kapal perang yang tenggelam di situ. Ada beberapa kargo, ada beberapa logistik, kapal logistik juga ada di Sumatera Barat, ada di Bali, the most famous diving site. We could use the USAT Liberty. This is the US Army Transport. Itu tersebar di beberapa area. Nah, yang memang banyak diangkat itu secara ilegal adalah kapal perang dan kapal perang yang battleship dan yang memang bernilai sangat signifikan itu yang ada di Selat Sunda dan Laut Jawa. Okay.
Well, there's one more. The Mustika near Kepulauan Riau.
Okay.
Mustika was involved in the foresaid operations in which Australians snuck in behind enemy lines in Singapore and blew up a whole lot of Japanese ships.
You're thinking of Operation Jaywick was the one that they got away with it. Mystica was an operation where they didn't make it to Singapore, but you are right, that wreck is still up there.
Yeah, they scuttled it, and it is somewhere in those waters. They haven't actually found it, but they have an idea of where it might be. So, yeah. Jaywick, you're right. Sorry about that.
You're thinking of the Crite, which is at the Maritime Museum.
Yeah.
Terima kasih, Natalie. Well, this is the end of the main session today. Thank you both. Thank you, Peter. Thank you, Natalie, for the remarkable learning session. And we hope that the students, adik-adik from Indonesia, more aware that we have historic wreck in our waters, in our territorial waters. We have and this is and hoping and surely need our involvement to give a good function in the future, and put it and keep the story for the better for our better relationship between countries and our respect for them and our respect of the battle and of the people who is the victim of the battle, and also and also enrich our knowledge the historical background of how Indonesia shaped today. Sekarang untuk quiz sebelum kita tutup, kakak-kakak, Mbak Yuki, Venta, Mbak Ciko, kuisnya boleh di-share. We play a little bit before we close, and I think Mbak Yuki will have some merchandises yang menjawab pertanyaan dengan cepat. Silahkan.
Zainab, should we jump off or should we stay on?
You can. Jump. It's okay. You can join the quiz if you want.
Might have an unfair advantage.
Thank you, Natalie. Thank you, Peter.
Thank you, Zainab, for this amazing opportunity. Yeah, it was a great chance to speak with all your students and teachers. Thank you, everybody, for coming today. It's nice to see so many people interested in this topic.
Okay.
Good luck
Thank
in
you
the
very much.
quiz. Yeah.
Thank you,
Bye.
and stay safe and healthy.
That's the idea.
Okay.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Goodbye, everyone.
Oke, ayo yang mau ikutan kuis, nanti silahkan Kak Ciko, Kak Yuki untuk memandu.
Terima kasih Kak Zainab, terima kasih Natalie dan Pete. Buat sahabat galeri, tadi udah di-share sama Kak Yuki di kolom chat, udah bisa lihat belum ya? Ada link, udah linknya sama sahabat Bari bisa diklik, nanti ada pertanyaan dan langsung dijawab. Kak Yuki.
Okay.
Udah dari sahabat galeri udah lihat semua ya. Oke, sahabat galeri bisa masuk nih. Kak Yuki bisa dilihatin udah berapa orang masuk nih. Nah, sekarang
nih ada 18 Kak Ciko Tenti.
ayo yang lain masuk lagi.
20.
Karena nanti 3 orang yang teratas akan dapat souvenir merchandise dari Marine Heritage Gallery. Kalau misalnya semuanya udah masuk nih, kita akan mulai. Kita mulai 30 detik lagi Kak Yuki ya.
Ya, boleh.
Udah ada penambahan belum nih?
Baru 21.
Ayo,
22.
ada sahabat galeri yang mau ikut lagi nih. Ada merchandise nih. Ada penambahan lagi Kak Yuki? Kalau nggak ada penambahan
Baru
kita bisa
24. Katanya 10 detik
24.
lagi ya. 25. Dihitung mundur aja Kak Tenti.
Ya.
Are you join Nat?
15.
Mau ikut ya?
Silakan Nat. 10. 5. Oke, Kak Yuki ada berapa peserta kita?
Ada 29. Oke, saya start sekarang ya.
Kita mulai ya.
Selamat menjawab. Semoga beruntung.
Sudah pertanyaan sudah semua Kak Yuki?
Nih kayaknya kita sudah dapat 3 yang teratas ya Kak Tenti ya.
Sudah. Kita udah dapat 3 teratas bagi sahabat galeri. Sudah terlihat di layar di screenshotnya. Untuk yang pertama atas nama Kemal dengan poin 4.520. Kalau Kemal bisa nyalain video, boleh silakan. Nanti kita terakhir kita tampilkan. Yang kedua Talia M.A dengan poin 4.200. Dan ketiga Marsinta NL dengan poin 4.180. Jadi 3 orang yang menjadi pemenang, bukan pemenang ya pemenang yang mendapatkan merchandise dari Marine Heritage Gallery. 3 orang itu boleh Kak Venta atau Kak Yuki bisa di spotlight yang mana pemenang kita 3.
Sudah Kak Tenti.
The fastest ya, the fastest 3.
Kayaknya masih kurang spotlight ya Kak Venta ya? Kok di saya masih
sudah ini sudah spotlight.
Udah spotlight ya.
Benar Kak Tenti.
Dari Natalie atau Kak Zainab ada sepatah 2 patah kata buat pemenang kita sebelum nanti kita menutup akhir acara kita hari ini.
Sedikit sulit bagi saya karena saya harus membaca dalam bahasa Indonesia. Kemudian translate.
Selamat ya buat Ataya, Kemal, Talia dengan Marsi. Artinya mengikuti dari awal karena pertanyaan-pertanyaannya itu diambil dari materi-materi yang disampaikan oleh Peter dengan Natalie. Nah, semoga adik-adik lebih aware kalau ada hal lain di perairan kita selain ikan dan terumbu karang, ada historic things there. Nah, itulah target dari learning session kali ini. Terima kasih sudah mengikuti kuisnya. Nah, nanti ditagih sama Kak Ciko, sama Kak Adria itu merchandise gallery. Apa saja sih merchandise-nya Kak Ciko?
Ya. Nanti buat yang Sobat Galeri yang 3 orang yang udah disebutkan sebagai pemenang yang mendapatkan merchandise dari kami, nanti bisa DM ya ke Instagram kami di @mhg.kkp. Jangan lupa buat Sobat Galeri yang lain untuk memfollow akun Instagram kami, dan terutama nih buat yang 3, jangan lupa di DM. Nanti di DM Kak, atau kalau sekarang sih Min, saya nih yang pemenangnya Min gitu kan. Jangan lupa, nanti kita tunggu, nanti kita bisa kirim ke Sahabat Galeri.
Ini pesan sponsor banget ya, ikuti Instagramnya Marine Heritage Gallery.
Ya. Boleh Kak Venta ditulis, diketik di kolom chat akun Instagramnya kita. Nanti Sahabat Galeri bisa meng-DM. Atau Sahabat Galeri yang ingin mengetahui update acara-acara dari Marine Heritage Gallery, bisa liatin Instagramnya. Kita akan upload rencana kegiatan learning session, atau kita juga ada mengupload ada apa aja sih di Marine Heritage Gallery, artefaknya ada apa aja sih, BMKT-nya ada apa aja sih, penjelasannya apa aja sih. Boleh, kalau ada yang mau ditanyain tinggal langsung di DM. Segitu Kak Zainab.
Terima kasih. Nah, dengan demikian sudah ada 3 the fastest dan sudah mengetahui ya bagaimana cara mengklaim merchandise-nya. Nanti tinggal kontak sesuai dengan nanti Kak Venta akan menjawab, merespon seperti apa nantinya, mau dikirim kemana, kontaknya di mana, dan mau dikirim kemana merchandise-nya. Oke, dengan berakhirnya kuis, berakhir pula learning session kita kali ini. Sampai ketemu di learning session Marine Heritage Gallery berikutnya bulan depan. Bulan ini sebenarnya di minggu keempat bulan Maret, karena ini kemarin kita libur, jadi kita geser ke tanggal 1. Nah, ikuti terus learning session reguler. Semoga kita semakin mengetahui Laut Indonesia itu seperti apa, sumber daya kita seperti apa, melalui sharing-sharing yang ada di learning session. Nah, di Marine Heritage Gallery juga memiliki YouTube channel untuk materi-materi tentang learning session sebelumnya, itu akan diupload melalui YouTube channel tersebut. Oke, kami akhiri dengan ucapan semoga semua tetap sehat, tetap semangat, tetap positif, dengan vibes yang positif tentunya, bukan positif COVID. Dan semoga yang sedang kurang enak badan cepat pulih kembali, tetap semangat untuk sembuh. Semoga kita ketemu kembali tidak dalam suasana pandemi di Marine Heritage Gallery. Dan untuk Natali, terima kasih sekali lagi. Ini sangat bermanfaat dan kami sangat mengapresiasi karena sudah bersedia memberikan cerita, berbagi cerita tentang The Battle of Sunda Strait, tepat 80 tahun.
Terima kasih banyak, Zanab. Tetap sehat ya.
Semua sehat.
Sampai ketemu lagi. Ya.
Sampai ketemu lagi. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Shalom. Om Swastiastu. Namo Buddhaya. Salam kebajikan. Rahayu.
Kak Venta, boleh di-share video sebelum kita menutup acara ini. Nanti Zoom-nya akan ditutup 5 menit setelah ini.
Bersama dulu, Kak Tenti.
Kenapa?
Foto bersama dulu boleh?
Oh iya, kita foto bersama. Oh, belum ya?
Belum.
Kepada sahabat galeri, Kak Zainab, Natalie, bisa dinyalain videonya ya. Kita foto bersama dulu. Boleh sahabat galeri yang belum menyalakan videonya bisa dinyalakan.
Ini terlalu serius nih kita nih.
Biar kita bisa foto bersama dulu.
Oke, dikasih aba-aba ya.
Jangan malu-malu dibuka videonya, diberikan senyum terbaiknya ya, sahabat galeri. Oke, Kak Venta, udah bisa difoto ya, Kak Venta ya?
Ya, yang pertama ya.
Oke.
1, 2, 3. Sekali lagi, di halaman selanjutnya. 1, 2, 3. Ya, terima kasih.
Terima kasih, Sobat
Galeri. Sebelum berakhir, itu boleh ya, Kak Venta, itu agenda berikutnya kita membahas apa ya? Kita membahas apa, topik apa, dan kalau boleh sebelum adik-adik leave dari grup yang masih ada ini, yang masih aware, itu ada Owen, masih ada mungkin tadi siapa, Marsi, ada usul kira-kira topik apa yang ingin didengarkan dari learning session Marine Heritage Gallery. Feel free sebelum leave dari halaman Zoom ini, feel free to give your thought, to give you idea, topik apa yang ingin kalian dengarkan tentang laut Indonesia loh ya. Karena kan memang learning session ini untuk kita lebih aware tentang laut atau perairan kita. Nah, boleh kalian adik-adik request di sini, nanti kakak-kakak mencoba meramu bagaimana kita bisa menyajikan itu ke adik-adik. Atau kalau ada Bapak Ibu guru yang mau mengusulkan kira-kira learning session dengan topik apa, boleh. Apakah misalnya goes to school itu kita perlu untuk goes to school atau seperti apa? Nah, boleh.
At the beginning of the 15th century, China was the leading power of the seas. In 1405, the Chinese Emperor Yongle sent a huge fleet to the sea. According to historical records, it consisted of about 300 ships, including more than 60 powerful treasure ships, fully loaded with valuable goods of the time. According to many sources, they were the largest sailing ships that had ever sailed the seas. The Chinese had accumulated a wealth of knowledge about navigation. They created the first accurate maps and advanced techniques such as the compass and celestial navigation. For centuries, they sailed on these ancient trade routes. From the East China Sea to Indonesia to India, the expeditions even led them as far as East Africa, long before the European discoverers landed here. But are the ancient sources credible? In recent years, wrecks were found showing the story of the Silk Road of the Sea in a new light. Belitung, Indonesia, now with its white beaches and clear water a paradise for tourists, it is a crossroads of ancient trade routes between the East and West. The narrow sea between the island makes it a real bottleneck, which all ships had to pass on their way. Reefs and shoals make this area dangerous waters, and a sudden storm or typhoon could mean the end of an entire fleet. The German diver Fred Dobberfuhl made sensational discoveries here. 2005 Dobberfuhl dived the wreck, to date the oldest in Asia. Scientific tests have shown more than 1,000 years it has lain on the seabed. On board a valuable cargo, goods from China and Arabia. But then the sensation. In one of 5 other wrecks from the 5th dynasties, the German research team found European amphorae. Were the Romans the founders of the maritime Silk Road?
Es gibt viele Hinweise, dass die Seidenstraße durchaus von den Römern gegründet wurde. In Rom bestand ein großer Bedarf an Luxusgütern, an Seide, dass man einfach gezwungen war, diese Seide nach Rom zu bringen. Und da bot sich der Seeweg an, dass man mit diesen Schiffen große Warenmengen transportieren konnte und mit diesen Schiffen die Seide nach Europa bringen konnte.
The trade links of those early years were more extensive than was previously thought. Goods, ideas and techniques exchanged from east to west. Among the most valuable trading goods were silk and porcelain, hugely popular in Europe, but only the Chinese knew the secret of its manufacture. And also with other groundbreaking inventions, the Chinese were pioneers. Even the paper, in China its production had been already perfected in the 2nd century. Arab traders brought it to Europe. Without the invention of paper, there would have been neither the printing press nor the modern era in Europe. The heyday of China on the world's oceans came to an abrupt end in 1433. A successor of the Emperor Yongle forbade the high shipping. The huge junks were scrapped. The construction of vessels of more than 3 masts were declared a capital crime. Centuries-old knowledge was destroyed. The Ming went into self-imposed isolation.
Durch das Zurückziehen, durch diese Abschottung im 15. Jahrhundert wurden diese Fahrten dann aber leider Gottes nicht mehr weitergeführt. Und so war ein Raum offen, der dann durch die europäischen Entdecker ausgefüllt werden konnte.
Less than 70 years later, the Europeans appeared on the Asian seas, far inferior in many ways, and they took over the trade in arms. Even today we can see the traces of European sailors in the world, and the large container ships that link the world satellite control these days still sail the old routes of the Silk Road of the Sea.